Um, so our firm, Studio Metropolitan Design Architects, is work is based on producing architecture that is relevant to the time, caring to the environment, and that is coincide with its environment from contextual point of view, nature and environment. You can look us up if you want on Studio Metropolitan Design website. Other than that, I'm gonna just spend a minute introducing Bill William Whitaker, for those who don't know him personally. He's a friend of mine. I felt honored to be able to do that today. Oops, sorry. A bit of a thing here. William Whitaker is a curator of architectural archives at the University of Pennsylvania, Stuart Weitzman School of Design. He is a co-author of the Houses of Louis Kahn, trained as an architect at the University of Pennsylvania and the University of New Mexico. Bill worked most closely with the archival collection of Louis Kahn, Lawrence Halpern, and the partnership of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown in support of teaching, scholarship, preservation, and public engagement. He also is a prolific writer, but some of the books that he has written, and he's put also exhibits, of which are the Experiment in Environment, the Halpern Workshop in for the Graham Foundation, and Ting inhabiting geometry, and most recently Design with Nature Now, a major program of the exhibitions, conference, and public programs that highlight the dynamics and visionary approach to the landscape design and development in the face of climate change and global urbanization. He is project director for what Minerva built, an exhibition project focused on the first American independent female architect, Minerva Parker Nichols. And to that, I'm going to let him speak and get off the line.
Thank you, Ailey. Thank you, Lori, and thank you everyone for coming. It was those of you who came out for the tour, it was a really exciting Sunday afternoon in the park, so to speak. So I really enjoyed the opportunity to walk around Cherokee, walk around Davidson Road, to experience the great architecture that is a part of Chestnut Hill and in that neighborhood and specifically. So, I mean, when Lori asked me to give this talk and to do the tours, it was in response to a current threat around the house for Mr. and Mrs. James Bond that's on Davidson Road. And it's a very special house. And it's a house that's got some very serious challenges right now. But I hope through events like this, we can raise the awareness of not just this extraordinary house, which I'll speak about a little bit today, but just, you know, to remind everybody about just how remarkable this heritage that we have, not just modernism, but architectural in general, not just in Chestnut Hill, but in Philadelphia, in our region and beyond. And so being here at the Architectural Archives, which we have a great collection of architectural records and the thinking of architects and landscape architects. So for me, it's always very stimulating to be able to connect the resources of an archive and looking closely at the creative thinking of designers and the team of people involved and the clients and all these different figures that are part of making places relevant and engaging. And to connect those experiences out there in the world through tours. And it's also a great pleasure to be able to speak to you today, to share some of what I know, but it's always interesting to put these stories together for the first time. And I haven't had an opportunity to speak about Cherokee before. I haven't really had an opportunity to speak about Davidson Road or Oscar Stoneroff for that matter. And I will say in the past several years, I've just become increasingly aware, and I think others too, that Oscar Stoneroff is somebody who we have maybe not paid enough attention to. He's an architect that engaged with modernism. He's someone who brought a deep understanding of what was going on in Europe to, of all places, Philadelphia in 1929. And I'll speak about that in a moment. But he, I think, first and foremost, brought a social commitment and sensibility to what architecture could do, how it impacts people's daily lives, and the ways in which he created mechanisms through which he could talk to people and engage with people, I think is quite remarkable and relevant. It's relevant to architecture and always will be, but sometimes more so than others. And so there's definitely a group of projects out there that I think we want to pay attention to, and Cherokee and Davidson Road are certainly among them. So my talk today, I'm going to touch upon the houses of Davidson Road. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Cherokee Village, Stoneroff and his clients, and a bit about the history of the site. I mean, just to understand what goes on before, what happens, how we relate to the past is something that is interesting in the history of Philadelphia's modernism or our understanding of it. And so to look at how the history of the site and what came on before, I spent some time sorting that out for myself. So hopefully I'll be able to make that clear to you guys tonight. And I'll just say this is my first pass on this topic. So I'm sure there's lots of gaps, which, in the future, I will do my best to fulfill. So without further ado, let me get this thing started.
Chestnut Hill.
The Athenaeum. Chestnut Hill has an archive.
Conservancy, right.
Chestnut Hill University.
Conservancy.
There's an
Please
institute.
mute yourself.
Yeah,
Are we not muted?
somebody's not muted, so I'll just wait until you got it. Okay. So I tweaked the title a little bit, and I've been thinking on a particular quality of Oscar Stoneroff's role, which I'll get to in a moment, but just the idea of finding modernism in translation. And here's a shot of Cherokee from about 1960. All right, so Oscar Stoneroff, just a really brief biography. He's born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1901, and he spends the first 19 years of his life living in an industrial city, a city where the worker housing is important. And in that city, an important emphasis is given on improving the quality of housing for the workers. There's architects, planners at many different scales that are investing in that, and also designers, women designers, who are reconceiving the efficiency of the kitchen and thinking about the daily lives of women and how you integrate that into housing that uplifts people and has the potential to do just that. And so the idea that there's a social side to architecture and into its place in bettering people's lives, the years after World War I, particularly in Europe, is a place where that is greatly energized. So at age 19, he leaves Frankfurt, never, to live in the city again, but it's certainly any modern architect interested in housing would be paying attention to what's going on in Frankfurt and other places. But Stoneroff moves to Florence and he's studying sculpture. He is living in Italy for 3 years. And before finishing a degree, he gets bored and he goes to Zurich and he jumps in feet first into architecture. And for 3 years is studying in Zurich at the ATA, the great technical university in Zurich, and Karl Moser and others who are important modern thinkers, modern architects and designers are among the faculty there. But he's restless, and before he gets his degree, he moves on again and he winds up in Paris. And in Paris, he jumps feet first again into the atelier of André Lersat, a great French modern architect in circles with Le Corbusier and others, and someone who's doing housing. So seeing that firsthand, we're starting to get into the mid to later 20s. He's also apprenticing with the great sculptor Mayol. So he's someone who has a hand in art, literally as a sculptor, and in making things by hand. He's someone who is grounded in the social side of architecture, as well as the kind of aesthetic, progressive modern side of architecture. And where does he wind up next? He winds up in Philadelphia in 1929. And so just putting that little itinerary together for me, when I started to think about Stonarov's experience, in many ways, he's quite different from the architects who we had here in Philadelphia. We had some Philadelphia architects who went to Paris and worked in France and came back. We have architects who did that vice versa, like Paul Kray, the great modern classicist. There are architects from the Bauhaus who were based in Berlin or in Dessau and wound up at any number of places in the United States. There's countless other examples. What got me thinking about Stonarov, about the idea of translation, is Stonarov was someone who's experiencing the change in the modern world of Europe after World War I and seeing it in the different contexts of his hometown of Frankfurt, in Florence, in Italy, in Zurich, in Paris, and so on. And so seeing the different ways that the ideas were deployed, if you will, or translated into specific contexts, I think makes him a rather remarkable figure. And I think we're very fortunate that he wound up here in Philadelphia. And so it was really a series of circumstances that brought him here that is maybe too detailed for tonight, but it was knowing the architect Alfred Kastner and wanting to do a competition together with Kastner for the Palace of the Soviets in 1929 that got him to Philadelphia. And he stayed, and he stayed here and worked out of Philadelphia the rest of his life. I mean, I think he went to Italy many times over the years, and he maintained a sculpture studio, and he worked as a sculptor, and he cast his work in outside of Florence. So I think there was always a connection there. But his home was Philadelphia in particular. And so it's the Carl Mackley houses, which is the first publicly financed housing project in the United States, built in Juniata Park in North Philadelphia, completed in 1935. That really puts him on the map as a houser, as someone who is profoundly invested in introducing new forms of housing and collective housing into the American context. That's drawing on the experience and the knowledge of what was going on in Europe, but translating it into the American context. The Carl Mackley houses, while abstraction is a quality, it's not a white box sitting in a city of the northeast of Philadelphia. It's built out of a wonderful modern brick, a big scale brick with a glazed tile, which is used in factories, which was something that was modern in its sense for the ease of cleaning the surface. He integrated parking underneath the building. So Americans are drawn to cars. This was something that was very different than the examples that one would see in Europe. So in a very simple way, you can see how he's taking the ideas and experiences that he had in Europe and understanding that in deploying them here, things must change. You must, adapt those ideas or allow them to mature in a setting and in response to the setting. To take care to understand the people and the place is an important value that Stonarov brings. And people like Lucan and others really pay attention to him and single him out as someone who helped elevate their sensibility to that, because Philadelphians were already inclined towards that. Our city and our history means something, or,
Bill?
Yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we've been looking at a very handsome picture of Oscar Stonarov, 1901 to 1970.
Yep.
Okay, just want
Yeah,
to
that's all right. I'm giving the little introduction and I'm going to go
I
on. Yeah.
apologize so much for interrupting you.
No problem. You get some of the images at the end, but it's through his, it's his work in the post-war era where he gathers together a bunch of the energy, the political energy that's directed towards change in the Better Philadelphia exhibition. He's working with boosters and other people who are interested in thinking more progressively about the future of the city, but essentially and very closely with Ed Bacon, Lucan, and others. 300,000 Philadelphians see that exhibit, and it really launches a series of progressive administrations in the 1950s and 60s under Clark and Dilworth and others, where a lot happens. And some of the clients on Davidson Road are right there in the trenches with Stoneroff and others advancing this political reform era. And so that's the kind of background for Stoneroff, and we'll return to him in a bit. But I want to, my talk has 4 parts, so I'm going to begin just with a simple idea of locating the Cherokee Village. And I'm using the name that was given the apartment complex at the time that it opened in 1954. It's now Cherokee Apartments, but I like the idea of a village. And I like the idea that Stoneroff was calling some of the houses along Davidson Road as cottages. And we know that this is built right up against Fairmount Park, and the beauty of the park and moving through that space is one of the great spaces of it's not quite wilderness to say the least, but it is certainly a place where we can get out, people living in the city, engage with the natural environment and landscape, and just appreciate the change of the seasons, animals, and so on. And here's a photograph from the Woodwards from Cresheim of just, of the Cressham Valley, of just, being able to sit by that stream and get away from the city. And that's the great attraction of that area. And, the idea that you could get in some sort of conveyance and get out and experience the park is one of the great joys of Philadelphia since the park was established. But it's also a place where, modernity comes in and cars come in. And, I'm endlessly fascinated by the photographs that one can find, usually attached to some sort of advertising for some sort of motor vehicle company like Premier that doesn't exist anymore. That was, the idea that you can hop in a car and go out and engage with the landscape around and just experience and come to new experiences. So who would not want to live in close proximity to the wonder of the Wissahickon Valley and Fairmount Park in a larger sense? And so hold on, let's see. Yeah, so I needed to kind of ground myself in understanding, well, what had happened before. You always knew that the family and the children of Henry Howard Furness, the great, not Furness, Woodward, sorry, the great railroad executive from the Pennsylvania Railroad, who had so much to do with the development of Chestnut Hill. And I won't go into detail there because I assume many of you guys know that or more knowledgeable than I am. But just to spatially understand those 3 estates along Cherokee Avenue and off McCallum that really back up against the park and are built in the 1880s, 1890s, and the first decade of the 20th century. An area called the Wissahickon Heights, and this is a fire insurance map from 1925, and you can see Drumoir by the Hewitt brothers for Henry Howard Houston, built in 1886. You can see to the right of that for his son-in-law, Charles Walcott Henry, Stonehurst by McKim, Mead and White from 1887. And then for his other son-in-law, Charles Woodward, Cresheim by Peabody and Stern from 1911. Of course, behind that are his children, 2 of which are women, and women figure in important ways in the making of architecture and landscape. And we should all do our best to recognize the role that women play in many levels of design. And so Sally Henry and Gertrude Woodward are 2 figures that figure in important ways into our story. But we're going to focus on Sally Henry and her middle daughter, Gertrude Henry, and her son-in-law, Donald Davidson Dodge, and her granddaughter, Cornelia, who marries Pierre Fraley. So this is the estate that was McKim, Mead and White, 1887, and it is on the site, on this site that Cherokee is built. So here's an aerial photograph where we can see that fire insurance map. just to give you a sense, there goes Kresheim. You can see a strong, going from the top to the bottom of the slide, a hedgerow of thick planting, giving way to a much more open space, the space between Kresheim and the McKim-Mead and White House, Stonehurst. That's where Davidson Road is. Drumoir is on the left side, and I've taken that off, and you get the road that takes you down to Valley Green. And this is the McKim-Mead and White House in the middle, with the pool, with the greenhouses, with the carriage house and other structures that were existing in that space. So here is a view from Mermaid Lane looking at the Henry House. This is kind of the French chateau style, and beyond you can see the Houston estate with its tower. And the landscape is quite different than we might experience it today, but there's many trees that are planted in there that become an important part of the development of Cherokee. This is some of the amazing finds that came out recently from the Olmsted archives, where the heritage of Olmsted and the Olmsted brothers in Philadelphia, but in Chestnut Hill, more specifically in the region around, Rob Fleming and Caroline Adams and a bunch of others pulled together. And I was just slack-jawed at the program that you all did, some months ago about the incredible finds. And so just to see how they make the alignment for the road approach into Stonehurst, this is being done in the first decade of the 20th century. So, maybe about 15 years after the house was first built. And this is the immediate context that precedes the development of Cherokee. There are elements, and you can see in the center of you can see where the residence is. You can see the road that moves around that, essentially becomes the alignment of Walcott, and also a great retaining wall that was the original forecourt for the house, that the remnants of that great stone retaining wall that provided places where carriages could initially turn around, that is still there. And when we did the tour on Sunday, we could very clearly see that from over on Davidson Road. And we know that there are other wonderful surviving examples from the Henry estate, from the McKim-Mead and White work, and from the Olmsted brothers work that still survive in various places around Cherokee. But it was exciting to start to put these bits and pieces together on a map so that you can start to see where they are in the landscape. And then this wonderful photograph of the porte cochere, and you could see how the vehicles or carriages or cars are moving around. But the estate after Mrs. Henry died was demolished in 1938. There was concern over the taxes that would be incurred relative to the estate after her death. So the family and the children demolished the house, and it was basically open land. There were obviously some fragments left of it, but this became the basis of the later work. And here's a wonderful photograph from the Olmsted Brothers archives, probably taken in the late 1880s, early 1890s from the Houston estate looking back, and you can see the road descending down to Valley Green. And that's the alignment of Walcott. So in many ways, there are many different layers of this previous house still existing, but it's utterly different. It's much more open as a landscape. I mean, okay, it's a winter photograph and the leaves have fallen off of the trees, but on the flat land around the house, it's much more open, but there are mature trees there. There are trees this is shown in about 1890. So by 1940, there were 50, 60, 70, 80-year-old trees, mature specimens, over 300 on the estate, that became an important focus for design work moving forward. So here's that aerial photograph from 1960 from the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, looking down at the first wave of building, 104 units on the Henry estate. we can see a little bit of Davidson Road and some of the houses. I'll get to that in a moment. And how this whole area is backing up into the park. And if I go to this for a moment, it just gives you a little bit of a sense of how those three estates associated with the larger Henry family, Houston family, related to one another, came to define that area of Chestnut Hill for decades before being given over to the second half of the 20th century to varying degrees of redevelopment. Okay, so that was our journey into the setting of the Wissahickon Heights and to that earlier history and the transition that leads us to Cherokee Village. So the family thinking is beginning about the future of that land starting in 1938, but because of the Depression, because of the war, because of various circumstances, it was not until the late years of the 1940s that momentum begins to build amongst the Henry family about what to do with the estate. And so about 30 years ago, a collection of the family's records related to Cherokee and its development were given to the Architectural Archives. So we have some letters here from Donald Davidson Dodge, from Stoneroff and others that shed a little bit of light. So here's a little excerpt from Donald Davidson Dodge. This is February 14th, Valentine's Day, 1949. He's writing to his brother-in-law, Bill Chatfield, regarding the issue of Stonehurst and their future plans. So, things were developing at this moment. And so he's writing to his brother-in-law. I feel convinced that something very worthwhile can be done with this land to fill a very pressing present need of housing in this area. And I feel that I have got the right people to put it through and promptly. Such a development, it seems to me, would considerably advance the prospect of development and use of a good deal of the Houston estate land, which we will have to wrestle with sooner or later. He goes on to reference his wife Gertrude and states, Gertrude is very keen about the place, and I always have been, and we have a great urge to do something worthwhile there, which would be a credit to the whole neighborhood, and as I say, would enhance the value of other surrounding Houston land. Of course, the interest of this architect in the matter is based on the future, for he can see Uncle Sam and Aunt Gertrude's property coming on the market before many years, and these three properties are unique in situation and advantages and beauty of environment in the whole Germantown and Chestnut Hill area. So the family getting together in February of 1949, thinking not just about Stonehurst, but maybe thinking about the development potential of the three estates. So there are some references to more than 100 acres being considered, or at least being thought about. So there's much more in behind the scenes conversation than just what starts in Cherokee Village in 1949. But the architect is Oscar Stoneroff. The architect that Donald Dodge is mentioning is Oscar Stoneroff. And here's the letter confirming a few days later, sending a survey from 1939 or 1940, which I wish we had, which shows the property presumably right after the house was demolished, presumably, at the beginning when they were starting to consider development. And I'll point out Wallace and Warner are architects who do quite a bit of housing and development work out in the main line and elsewhere. So there might be an earlier iteration of land planning around the area that precedes Cherokee Village and precedes Stoneroff. And of course, around this time in 1949, actually a little bit before, the Houston family has a lot of land over in Andorra and Roxborough area. And while it may not be well known now, but Philadelphia was the odds-on favorite in 1946-47 to be the home for the United Nations. And it's the main buildings would have been over on the Belmont Plateau in Philadelphia, but basically the Secretariat and many of the other facilities would have been in, at least according to the proposals, up in Andorra. And so the idea that you would have an influx of new building and exciting modern development in the area of Roxborough, Andorra, and then building bridges across the Wissahickon Valley and so on to make these connections. There's a lot of energy in this time, although by 1949, the decision has been made and they're actually starting to design the United Nations on land that at the 11th hour, the Rockefeller family donated to make sure it stayed in New York rather than coming to Philadelphia. So a few years later, here is the official stationery for Cherokee at Mermaid Lane and McCallum Street. Oscar Stoneroff is writing affectionately yours to the Dodges, who were at their summer house up in Rockport, Maine, and just recognizing the historic moment that they got the stationery intact, but I think in the following year they were starting to rent out the Cherokee, and there is some evidence that Stoneroff was in some ways had a stake, a financial stake in Cherokee. And the idea that development and architects and a complicated team of investors who can be involved, it's something that can be tricky in terms of understanding in its architectural history, but there's very exciting ideas that can come out of that, the social relationships, the political causes and interests, and how teams of people who get together and come together to do good work in the world can get very interesting. But things come down to dollars and cents, and here we see the back and forth between architect and client over the costs associated with your architect's fee, the total cost for the development, what the building cost, what the developer, the builder received, additional costs along the way, and what was due Stoneroff in February of 1954 to settle accounts, which was roughly $6,000. So he got a $60,000 fee. So he did pretty good. This is among the records that survive here in the Architectural Archives. So we can see the first development. We can see where Walcott Lane is. Davidson is at the bottom. Cornelia is the cul-de-sac in the top left. The shaded area and the 13 buildings, I think it's 13, are what was built on the site. And so let's explore that a little. So if I just fade through this, you can see the former estate, the position of the house, the forecourt to the house that still exists, where there's just simply now parking. You get a sense of where some of the trees exist. And then the idea that they were not just planning 104 units, they actually got the site permitted for right at 300 units. And you can see that they had a much more ambitious plan of additional developments around apartment living. And you can see Cornelia, the cul-de-sac at the top left, a series of buildings there, but right in the heart where the jug handle of Walcott is, there was a high-rise apartment building that I think would have been 7 to 9 stories high, right in the heart of this development, which obviously never happened. There was another 2 or 3 buildings that were built in 1959, kind of a phase 2. And then future development was given over to single-family housing along Cornelia and in other sites. Davidson Road being the exception, that was decided to be single-family homes from the get-go, and I'll get to that in a moment. So here is a rendering from the Dodge's collection of Cherokee materials here at the archives. This is out of Stoneroff's office and is showing one of the 2-story blocks of mixed apartments, so 2, 3, 4 bedroom houses, allowing for outdoor living on terraces and on balconies, on covered balconies. We can see a photograph of part of the initial building campaign where you could see this slope, and this is the building on the right is standing where the original house was, and you can see that there's some evergreen trees, some deciduous trees, some other types of trees, but other elements. And so if I turn to one of the landscape drawings, and this is a blueprint that's actually rendered, it's a detail by the landscape architect Cornelia Hahn Oberlander. She worked with Stoneroff, she worked with Lucan, she worked with Dan Kiley. She's one of the great landscape architects of the 20th century. And if I'm not mistaken, she's still alive. And if I'm not mistaken, she I think just turned 101 years old. And so she's a wonderful woman, and I had the chance to show her these drawings about 8-9 years ago. And she regaled, it was part of a tour that was brought here by the Landscape Architecture Foundation, or the Cultural Landscape Foundation rather. And she regaled us all with the adventure of this project, of starting with a survey, a detailed survey of all the existing landscape elements, all the trees, all the walks, the walls, the existing features, but specifically with the trees, making decisions about which trees should be saved, which trees they wanted to save, and then the planning of where to put the buildings, related to that. And in this rendering in particular, and if I go back for a second, that view corridor that I've got in blue on the map, that's where you're looking. The trees that are simply circles that are not shaded in are existing trees, either deciduous or coniferous. The ones that are shaded are the ones that are new trees. And of course, you're going to need that, or new shrubs and other types of plantings, because obviously you're making things much denser. So building 13, the left half is where the original house was. And above it in the plan, you could see a walled area, and that's one of the ruins. I think, I don't know whether it's there. I didn't have time to actually scout some of these out, but I'm excited to. And then other areas which would be given over to tenants to having their own individual planting beds. Going a little farther, this is around Long Walcott. This is a period photograph from the late 1950s by Irwin Stein. Philadelphia architect trained here at Penn, but someone who worked for Oscar Stoneroff in the 50s, I think on that first wave of building in Cherokee. So did Mather Lippincott, so did Bob Venturi. There was a lot of people who were working for Stoneroff in the early 50s and later for that matter. But there's an important group of architects in the drafting room at the time this is being done. So this is along Walcott. And we see these buildings are red brick. We see they're white and red brick. And so hold that in your mind. But there's a magnificent beech tree or ash tree that's in the center of things. So when I go to that landscape plan, you can see some of the large trees, which were just adjacent to the main approach of the original house. So I'm very curious about looking more closely at the trees and about what may have been planted by the Olmsteds and what Cornelia was recognizing as a value of what came before. And also Stoneroff was recognizing a value of what came before in this magnificent landscape. But that's one of the bigger qualities of Philadelphia modernism. So this is a version of that, right? And then working with the contours of the landscape and how you site the buildings so that you could preserve, or at least, work with the existing landscape to preserve the qualities that are strongest. And this is a wonderful photograph by John Ebstall, who's one of the great architectural photographers. He was a favorite of Lucan's, and he is so wonderful about capturing the human element of interacting with spaces. And this is a beautiful photograph where you see the older existing landscape elements, how Cornelia's design in terms of planting beds, smaller shrubs, seating areas, paved areas are integrating into a series of spaces that you could get together with your neighbors. So this planting plan reveals in that area around that brick seating area, there are 15 or more existing trees that they were working very closely with. And we have enough design development preserved in the collection where you could see there were very different arrangements for the buildings along McCallum Street, longer bar buildings that were parallel with the street rather than turned perpendicular to it. And I think here you're seeing the concern for the existing landscape coming into focus, and them, the design team, making the most out of it. We can see where they used retaining walls rather than regrading the site, maintaining the existing kind of rolling sense of the landscape rather than making it even, which might have been the easier way of doing things. But that involved stone retaining walls, as we see in the lower center of this photograph. And that's the area that we're viewing from, building 28. And you can see that little retaining wall coming out, and it's clearly an existing tree. The circle that's not shaded in being indicative of that, but just look around building 30, building 29, how they're just, slipping a building within that existing setting. So building 28 and 29, we're seeing building 29 involving under, parking. So the integration of parking within it, and the cut there to allow for that is using Wissahick and schist rather than brick. And we see that here. And then that's the view looking back. Of course, the interiors, I think these are model examples being shown. And I just have to think that the furnishings were perhaps organized by Gray Associates, which was the great modern furnishings store up in Chestnut Hill run by Georgia Perkins. And, again, that's where, modernism and how it's brought into communities and into neighborhoods and into people's houses and living rooms is fascinating. And there's many ways that happened. Wonderful to see an early television set sitting on what looks to be something similar to a George Nelson bench. But this wonderful panorama of street, of cluster housing, of public spaces. And I can't help but just, think about places like Linden Court by Edmund Gilchrist from 1915, red brick, white stucco, white wood trim, related to the entrances, working with the topography, shaping it in nice ways. And of course, there's French Village, the Howe Fraley houses along Germantown Avenue at Chestnut Hill Avenue that George Howe did for his mother. There's so many examples in and around Philadelphia where one builds in this way in cluster housing more densely to diversify the possibilities of housing. Okay, so let me shift gears to Davidson Road and to the houses along it, returning us to that wonderful aerial photograph. And then to point out, I'm going to highlight 3 houses that were existing in 1960. Gertrude Dodge's house by Oscar Stoneroff, 1956. Mary Wickham Bond's house from 1955. Mary Alice Franz's house from 1956-57. So those 3, the major clients are all women. So like Robert Vittori's mother's house, like Lucan's Margaret Esherick house, like Aldo Jurgala's Dorothy Rayburn White, you've got another example of where, powerful independent women, they're married or recently widowed, are the drivers for architectural design and expression, which is always an interesting story. Existing on the cul-de-sac was the Pearson House by Francis Kaufman, Wilkinson, and Pepper. I just don't have a lot of information on that house. But anyway, so here is the Gertrude Dodge house, photograph taken not too long ago by my colleague Betsy Manning, where you see the house just tucking into this little valley. And well, Oscar Stoneroff did a wonderful exhibition about the Better Philadelphia exhibit at Gimbel's department store, of all places. A few years later, he followed up with a retrospective about Frank Lloyd Wright. And amongst the projects exhibited were La Miniatura, the Millard House in Pasadena by Frank Lloyd Wright of 1923. And that is a house that is wonderfully tucked in and nestled into a little valley. It's kind of one of those impossible houses that steps down into a narrow ravine, and where you start in a kind of enclosed, tight area, you get this explosion into the valley, into the treetops. And that is a consistent theme that we see throughout Stoneroff's three houses. And I just want to read you a little quote that Stoneroff said that gets at some of these qualities that are on his mind. So he's speaking about his own artistic development and sensibilities. My mixture, this is Stoneroff speaking, in upbringing is Le Corbusier being the great Swiss-French architect, modernist, credible influence on modernism and 20th century art and design. So my upbringing is Le Corbusier by intellect and Frank Lloyd Wright by instinct. I am an urban dweller of the country. I live in a modern house. I have the intellect of a city dweller, but the inclinations of an iconoclast in fireplace, horse riding, and loneliness. Everybody needs a cave. So Stoneroff's architecture wonderfully nestles down into this incredible landscape that is opening up into the Wissahickon Valley. The slopes are steep. The houses have to tuck in to and nestle themselves into the hill so that they make space for the landscape to move around. And there's a value to that. So this is the Mr. and Mrs. James Bond house. And this is Mary Wickham Bond and James Bond. And James Bond is an ornithologist and curator at the Academy of Natural Sciences, someone whose family had a long history in Philadelphia, dating back to the colonial era. And as a scientist, he's really the one that helped understand and document that the birds and the wildlife in the Caribbean islands in the West Indies really come from North America rather than South America. And around Trinidad and Tobago is the split between North and South, and that's called the Bond line. But what I think I knew, but had forgotten before the crisis around this house, and this is the house that is of concern in terms of its heritage and preservation, was the story of James Bond. So there was an article in Rogue magazine in February 1961, quoting Ian Fleming, disclosing the fact that he has named his character after a real person. Fleming said, "He's an American ornithologist, not a secret agent." Fleming was quoted as saying, "I read a book of his, and when I was casting about for a natural sounding name of my hero, I recalled the book Birds of the West Indies and lifted the author's name outright." So how cool is it that we've got a house, and this is the only photograph I've got of it, and it's not really easy to photograph right now. I think that trellis that's there is a later edition, but I made a little sketch using PowerPoint here, and forgive, it's rather crude. And we have Mary's description, Mrs. James Bond's description of it, that, she was really given over, how lucky to be married to a man who wasn't too particular where he lived and took little interest in architecture. So basically she said that she could have everything her own way. And then she went on to describe the house. Okay, and where is it? So it was built of soft, rosy brick. This is Mrs. Bond speaking. Glass and aluminum tucked into the side of a ravine. The flat roof was but 1 foot higher than the street. The next level was down about 18 steps to a carport, kitchen, spacious front hall, dining room, porch, and a small bedroom and bath. On the ground level, there were 2 bedrooms, a large bath, and a huge living room 20 feet high. On one end wall was solid brick inside and out. The other was composed of glass, and on 2 sides, aluminum. I faced the problem of 20-foot curtains. Outside were patios, the terraces sloping down towards the site of the Henry swimming pool, now empty, cracked and full of fallen trees. The woodland area of tulip poplars towered over the whole area. The stairways were appalling, one outside from porch to patio, the other inside from front hall to living room. A huge mahogany beam ran the length of the house through the wall to the patio, from which Oscar slung slender black iron rods like harp strings attached to slabs of pine wood that served as steps. It took courage to walk up and down these contraptions, but we got used to them. A cottage, really a monstrosity in my eyes, but it was at the edge of the Wissahickon. You know, the Bonds planted pine trees, flowering shrubs, Japanese maples, dogwoods, rhododendrons, etc. It took a few years for them to take hold, but each spring it was a joy to see them flourish. In fact, for about 20 years or so, it was quite a lovely place for them to live. Its theatrical personality crying for large entertaining. Occasionally we lived up to its expectations, but preferred to see our friends in smaller numbers. And so in this drawing, you get a sense of the stepping down, the horizontal line, giving us a sense when you drive by, when you pass by, you really barely see the house. And then as you move down through it, the landscape opens up and reveals itself in its different layers. At the end of the cul-de-sac is Mary Alice Franz's house. And she was someone who was quite politically active. And you see her name associated with Stoneroff in progressive Democratic political campaigns and advertising related to Adlai Stevenson and others. And this was a house that she built just a few years after her husband, after her second husband died. So she independently built this house. So I'm curious about what her motivations were for that, but she sold it to the great landscape architect Ian McHarg and his family. And it was in this space that he wrote his famous book, Design with Nature, and he did the landscape around. But here's just another little sketch of mine, giving you a sense of entering into the house past a wall that rather encloses the landscape. And then through a wall of windows, you enter a dining space, the kitchen on your left, and then descending down a flight of steps into a cozy, nestled, covered by the master bedroom area where there's an ingle nook for a fireplace, a reading area with a clear story window or a little low horizontal window that faces the front of the house, and then steps that you could exit right out to the south and to the west of the house. And then the bedrooms for the children up above to the left. This was an area that Ian McHarg did the landscape on. He's best known as a thinker of how to design with nature rather than against it. He thinks at the regional level and at great scale, because if we're going to make a difference in designing ecologically, you have to think at that scale. But he began his life in landscape as an apprentice at 16 years old, working in and around Glasgow, Scotland. So setting stones, choosing plants in the mode of a modern landscape architect was something that he knew. So he designed the basin that we see here, the pond, the brick terracing, and then this wonderful fountain, little rivulet of water that moved through the steps and through the walls of the stone and moss, and then down into the pool. Here's Ian with a pickaxe making that pond, and still we see how open, relatively speaking, to today, that larger landscape was, and how green and grown in it's gotten over the years. And looking up the hill, the house is on the left, just a little bit out of view behind the flowering trees. There are other houses along Davidson, and this is where I will admit this is a first pass. I do not have as much as I would like to have on the other houses for the Salix by Bill McDowell, the Cassery House by Stoneroff and Hawes from 1963, the other Pearson House from 1958, but that's maybe things that we can get to in future times. But what I do have, and this is the third part, and we'll be wrapping up in about 8 or 9 minutes, the unbuilt. So at the end of Davidson Road, I think it was always, Stoneroff was going to build Gertrude Dodge's house. They're the clients, they're the owners, the significant stakeholders in Cherokee. They're planting a flag in terms of building their own house, which they live in for a few years. The Bonds initially take their house as a lease, as a 10-year lease. They buy it and they live in it until 1977. That's further down by the cul-de-sac. But on the position of the Franz house would have been a Lucan house, but for Francis Adler, the great ophthalmologist. The Pearson house, an earlier iteration, I presume for the same client, by Robert Venturi, his first independent work, and just around the cul-de-sac, the Halter house by Richard Neutra from 1960. So in the archives collection, we have drawings in our Thaddeus Longstreth collection. This is the Halter house viewed from the south. and how it sat into Davidson Road. The Adler House by Lou Kahn exploring the material of Wissahickon schist and red brick and stepping down the landscape in a much more ordered fashion, a series of pavilions interlinked and distinctly containing different programmatic or functional elements, but also engaging with the landscape in an interesting way. But it's really Venturi's house, his first independent project, 1957-58, that's quite remarkable. It too is a series of linked pavilions, close packed, with walls coming off that are detached from the functional aspects of design and are, in a sense, enclosure, give one a sense of ruin. We can see at the far right an enclosed garden, preserving a sense of ruin. Lou Kahn talks about wrapping buildings with ruins. Well, this is several years before Kahn starts talking in that regard. Venturi on the inside, thinking about the room unit as an essential part of architecture. Kahn was thinking along those lines. And in the year before Venturi is doing this design, he was working for Lou Kahn. So there are two architects working very closely together. And here we see a series of essentially square rooms, but not quite. So I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes, and here's my concluding thought. So maybe another layer that we put on top of this, we thought, about situating Cherokee Village within this longer history of living near the Wissahickon, living by the park, the families involved, how development changes, how people get from place to place changes over time. But the way that place matters, the way that history matters and what comes before is something that's worth relating to. But in how people engage with space is also important. Here's one of the great houses by George Howe, William Stix Wasserman out in White Marsh, the classic photograph in black and white, but you get a color photograph and you see the red brick, you see the Wissahickon schist, you see the two great materials of Philadelphia architecture that really is embedded in the geology underneath our city. This is a geological map. It's actually a student drawing from here at Penn, one of Ian McHarg's student studios. But the yellow area is the coastal plain and an area of great clay deposits right underneath the center of the city of Philadelphia. And then that wonderful dark red and crimson and bright red, that's the Piedmont. And that's where all our amazing Wissahickon schist are. So the idea that up in Chestnut Hill is a building material that begins to identify with the quality of localization, just as in Center City and in Old City, Philadelphia is the same thing. So Philadelphia for a long time was known as, under the moniker, as the Red City. And here's one of those great 19th century aerial views. And you see the red glow of the city, row houses and whatnot. We've got marble buildings and things like that, but I would turn your attention to Cope and Stewardson, our great collegiate Gothic architects working at Bryn Mawr in the late 1880s. At Pembroke, building in stone, building out of that magnificent Wissahickon schist. And this is also an amazing landscape by Olmsted, Frederick Law, also continued on by the brothers. But when it came to build at Penn, the quadrangle dormitories, it was a building of brick, and that there was a sense of urbanity, and the connection between city and country is something that can flow and does flow creatively through the decisions that architects and landscape architects make in our region. But you see it in buildings by other architects like Kenneth Day. This is the son of Frank Miles Day, who is a Chestnut Hill resident, really Mount Airy, but does Violet Oakley's house and also does Hickory Hill, his own house at the end of Mount Airy Avenue. In West Mount Airy. This is his son in 1937, building out of local stone and using exterior cypress, but letting it weather. Here's Lou Kahn learning from that same tradition in 1940 in Elkins Park and turning to materials that the great arts and crafts, Mercer tile work and so on. But, this photograph by John Ebstel with Pennsylvania Dutch redware on the tables, signaling what came before as something of interest. So here's Oscar. I showed you the Carl Mackley houses, that social side of design, that sense that, we should engage with and connect with the people who are going to use the building. And I'll end with a quote that ties that together. The house he did for himself once he marries Betty Foster. This is out near Phoenixville. This is Avon Lee Farm, 1938. You can see Oscar engaging with an old farmhouse, carving out a space within it and thinking expansively about the creative potential of living outside, eating outside, and so on. There's also this larger context that involves Betty Stoneroff, Ruth Bacon, and the creation of the Charlestown Playhouse in terms of thinking progressively about education and about early childhood education. So there are many layers of modernism that goes on in Philadelphia and the city and region, and that involves our orchestra, our art museum, our collectors, and so many layers. But Charlestown and Oscar Stoneroff and the group of designers out there become very important. So here's Ed Bacon's house, Little Saffron, that is Stoneroff and Kahn. This is a newly discovered Stoneroff and Kahn project. We didn't know that this was done under Stoneroff and Kahn, but Jim Garrison has been doing a marvelous job of documenting the heritage out in Charlestown. They found the site plan and the drawings for this. This is for Ed Bacon and his family. And this is a wonderful house. This is looking out from the older house and opening it up to the landscape. Dan Kiley, the great landscape architect that Cornelia Oberlander was working with, did the early landscape plan. And this is opening up to a new sense of connection to the outdoors. And I think perhaps more importantly, here is the kitchen area opening up to the child's play area, opening up out into an outdoor space, just following the contours of the land, incorporating new modes of life and lifestyle. And you can see in the plan, the heavy walls of the original house giving way to this modern addition, and then the master bedroom being dramatically opened to the outside. Here's the Better Philadelphia exhibition that I mentioned at the lead-in. This is an idea where you are connecting with the people of Philadelphia and giving them a sense of the idea that what the work that architects do and planners do have to connect in a larger scale. And I'll get to that in a moment. But at the same time that Stoneroff is working on Cherokee, he's working on the Friends Cooperative in just above Girard, or Spring Garden Street in Philadelphia. And this is where there was an existing group of houses they bought the entire block, they renovated the houses, they used the space collectively in between for common space and turned these into rental housing for low income people and individuals, but to think collectively and to add amenities in that landscape are important. So that's at the same time as this. So, in a high, more affluent area and in other areas of the city. So I want to end with a remembrance that Ed Bacon wrote just after Oscar Stoneroff died. Oscar Stoneroff died in a plane crash in 1970. He was accompanying Walter Reuther, the head of the United Auto Workers, to a site in northern Michigan where Stoneroff had just completed the design of the United Auto Workers family recreation area on the northern part of Michigan. Beautiful buildings set in a beautiful landscape, very similar to Cherokee. So this is Oscar Stoneroff. This is Ed Bacon. Oscar Stoneroff was concerned not just about buildings, but about entire cities. He gave expression to this concern in 1947 at his Better Philadelphia exhibition. This great vision of a total city recast and renewed gave the initial impetus to Philadelphia's rebuilding and set the tone for much of what has happened since and what is still going on. Oscar's concern for the dilapidated sections of the city and the people who lived there led him to a series of projects combining physical renewal with social experiment. He was one of the first to see the potential in revitalizing what was already there rather than tearing it down. His friend's self-help project in East Poplar was one of the earliest urban renewal redevelopment efforts to be based on rehabilitation and stands today as a forerunner of a major movement. By that, Bacon is referring to places like Society Hill. Oscar, before most others, Bacon said, saw that this work must be done shoulder to shoulder with the residents that would be affected. The document he prepared with Louis Kahn in 1944, You and Your Neighborhood, is as fresh today as it was the day it was written. It establishes a recipe for a process that will take architecture out of the hothouse of professionalism and make it a life force in cities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. It was not only wonderful for the architecture and the history, but the look at individual lives and how they affected the development and the way we are living and proceeding now. I also want to thank our program co-chairs, Jean McCoubry and Susan Peck. Also our wonderful sponsors who allow us to make the programs that we're doing possible, including Ali Italia. Thank you, Ali. And I'm just reminding everybody about our Pistorius Park exhibit in Killian's Hardware windows along Germantown Avenue. And also that we will have our Conservancy's annual meeting on Sunday, January 8th. But most of all, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. It was a wonderful evening, as it was a wonderful tour the days before. And for the Conservancy, I will turn it over now to questions and answers. Thank you so much.
I've left you all speechless.
So
Come on,
Jean,
the tour people had many more questions.
yeah, so we don't have any questions in the chat. Charlene has asked, please share about Hopkinson House. So Jean, this is your job. I'm stepping on, sorry.
That's okay. I slow to react. Hopkinson House. Do you have some nuggets on that, Bill?
Yeah, I mean, in the interest of time, I didn't go a lot into Stoneroff's work outside of a few houses to show him working within an existing context. But, Society Hill is something that Bacon was making reference to with respect to Stoneroff's sensibilities. And I think, as many of you know, there was a competition in 1959 where groups of architects, developers, builders, landscape architects, and planners got together and made proposals to the city of Philadelphia and the City Planning Commission to make decisions about how best to go about redeveloping Society Hill. And Oscar Stoneroff worked alongside, worked on the same team with Ian McHarg, with Harrison and Abramovitz up in New York, but that scheme was always known as the Stoneroff scheme. So it seems that Stoneroff really took the lead on it. And wonderful scheme. We actually have original renderings for it. We've got some nice juicy tidbits. But I think we know that that IMPay and Webb and Knapp were awarded the contract, and that IMPay did a lot of the low rises in the area just to the south, to the west of Society Hill Towers, and then a block away, another group. But in an unusual twist, they kind of also awarded Stoneroff's team, the development of Hopkinson House on Washington Square, and that context was quite different than the kind of heart of Society Hill. And they also wanted to increase and have a higher level of density that could be brought into the city. So while there were parcels for one houses or double lots where you could build a bigger house, and there's amazing houses, Stoneroff did a wonderful house for Nancy Grace at 4th and Cypress, which built on an older structure, both a guest house and a pavilion for that must have been the scene of some amazing parties. There was also a larger scale apartment building that, allowed a much wider range of people to engage and to move into those neighborhoods and basically to bring energy back into those spaces. So that's about all I know about Hopkinson House. So
Bill, this is a slightly more open-ended question, but Carolyn Adams and John Meggs are asking, what is going on in Philadelphia that is a worthy follow-on to what Stoneroff and Bacon did earlier? Did Stoneroff continue doing both public housing and private residences?
yeah, I mean, he's like a lot of Philadelphia architects, Lou Kahn and others. I mean, he did public housing, right? And the one that probably everyone knows, because if you're in Chestnut Hill, you probably drove by it for years, was the Schuylkill Falls housing, and that was something that was not so successful, right? Slightly more successful, but not in the long run, was Southwark, down just north of Washington Avenue, and that again was with Ian McHarg working on landscape. Not so successful in the long run, but that could be said of a lot of the public housing and the challenges. But I think he saw within that space, communities that needed to be served and work that needed to be done. There's I forget the name of it, but it's the round tower that's right next to the Four Seasons on the Ben Franklin Parkway. That's I think one of the more visible buildings, and it's an interesting one on the Ben Franklin Parkway. How you situate a building on the Parkway is not easy. Aldo Jurgula and Mitchell Jurgula did an amazing job, very Philadelphian in the Philadelphia school sense of the word, on at the United Fund building just across the way from Stoneroff's. But the public sculpture that's part of it, the more sculptural quality of the building, I think speaks to an interest that Stoneroff had. Hopkinson House is part of it, but there's like Casa Fermi, no, Casa. I mean, there's definitely some other housing projects that address a range of housing types and community groups take you into the 60s. But I would point to his last work, which is the one for the United Auto Workers, is that retreat. That's a very elegant building. But I think Stoneroff is someone that, as I was saying before, he's someone that we need to understand more about. And what I was alluding to in terms of understanding modernism through translation is to understand the role that he played moving through these worlds that were not just the spatial worlds of European modernism, art and sculpture and design, and bringing that knowledge back and forth between Europe and Philadelphia in the circles. But he was also very politically engaged. He was also very, his wife and Ruth Bacon were very engaged in education. He's one of those like butterflies that move around and flit around, and that sometimes you don't take those individuals seriously. But the connectivity that is embodied within his work, I think, is actually very remarkable and worthy of some deeper understanding. Not to single him out as a hero figure, because I'm not sure that's something that is as interesting now or is something that would interest him so much as, how you integrate social concern and concern for what comes before, how you translate ideals into real world solutions that can happen. That's one of the thoughts that Lou Kahn, in his remembrances of Stoneroff at the time that he died, that Stoneroff died in 1970, was pointing out to the lightning quick way that Stoneroff could visualize how to make something happen and how to harness the mechanisms through which you would get that thing built in order to do something in the world. And I think that's something we ought to know more about. So stay tuned. I think there's a bunch of us out there who keep talking with one another saying, what are we going to do about this heritage? And I think, I'm excited that I had an opportunity to think a little bit on Cherokee and to see some of the context in which he's working, and starting to think about how that's part of a larger story that has, in a sense been, lost to, important studies of people like Lou Kahn, Bob Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, Ian McHarg, and others who are part of the Philadelphia school, but there's much more going on than that. And Oscar's someone who touched on all those individuals that I just mentioned in important ways.
Bill, do you know Otto Reichert?
Yeah,
Because
Yeah.
Otto is 97. He lives in Chestnut Hill in Hill House, and he came to Philadelphia to work for Oscar. I
it
don't know-
doesn't surprise me.
Huh?
It doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, he was a student at Harvard, and Stoneroff came to give a lecture, and afterwards they spoke to each other in German. And Oscar said, "Otto, why don't you come visit me in Philadelphia?" And so he did, and he offered him a job, and that's how he ended up here.
Well, the document that I quoted Ed Bacon from was part of a collection of materials that Otto has. He gave us 2 tranches of materials that are. It's a small box of materials, but it's really that he was the driving force, or at least the person on the ground getting the job done of putting together a memorial exhibition about Oscar just after he died. And this is one of the things I pointed out in the tour up on Davidson Road. It's, usually when someone dies, you want to do a big book, or you want to do an exhibit in an exhibition, in a museum or something like that. And when Oscar died, they didn't do that. When Oscar died, they chose 7 or 8 sites in and around the city, and they did pop-up exhibits. And so Otto's files related to that effort were getting access to the lobby of the IBM building in Penn Center, getting access to other spaces in and around the city where specific projects of Oscar's work could be put on view in the city itself, where he was engaging with and thinking about. And that was part of the message or the example that people wanted to put forward in thinking about Oscar was the way in which he saw the value in connecting with the people who would ultimately use the spaces. So I'm really, Ed Bacon said, I think it very elegantly. But here's a shout out to Otto for his connection to Stoneroff, and for giving a collection here that I could make use of in putting this talk together very quickly, with that focus on this kind of this urgency around the future of the Bond House and the concern associated with that. We don't want to forget that. But that's the Bond House is a really very cool house. It's a very kind of exceptional house. And I think it stirred things up in Philadelphia. It's also where you have to think about the parties and the events and the engagements that happened in that space that, we're overlooking the Wissahickon Valley, overlooking the Gresham Valley, overlooking that tight little landscape that has so many layers of history. And I want to know more. I want to be able to walk in that house and see it in a way that it has its strength. And right now it's in a place of weakness. And I hope that there's a more positive outcome in its future.
Jean, do you want to read any more questions?
Hi, Jean, sorry, your microphone is muted. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I don't see any more questions in the chat box. If anyone wants to speak up, why don't you just speak? Oh, Charlene's asking, when is the next tour of the James Bond house? Well, it wasn't really a tour, but.
Yeah, Bill, the question that we have, Bill, is what's happening now in this city that is worthy of the heritage that you have so eloquently described here?
You mean in terms of thinking progressively about actually, understanding what's there and preserving it?
Well, I'm talking about the sort of mix of city planning and well, actually architecture with a social consciousness to it. That was, I think, what you were describing, that Oscar and certainly Ed Bacon were really all about.
Yeah, no, I mean, at the lead-in, it was noted that the organization DocuMomo was kind of co-sponsoring, and DocuMomo is a mouthful, but it's Documentation and Conservation of Works of the Modern Movement. It's a European-based organization. So Dan Macy and I were the local co-chairs for that. And in putting that together, Oscar Stoneroff was like, all of a sudden, Jim Garrison and others were doing tours. His great-granddaughter gave a talk. People got to see a lot of Oscar's work, and it looked good. But as a lead-in to the conference, which was over the course of, I think, 3 or 4 days, we had Inga Safran and Mike Lewis speak. And Inga gave a great, there was so many great talks, but Inga, Mike gave great talks. But Inga was pointing to the fact of how so much of the development that goes on in the city is driven by metrics of real estate investment, where architects and, it's just a different metric on how work gets done. And the people who build the projects no longer own them for decades. So, while the Henry family, the extended Henry family and the Woodward family and the Houston family don't own Cherokee anymore. I don't think so. They owned it for an awfully long time, and they recognized that, Chestnut Hill is exceptional because there was a group of people who had a vision for how to develop things over long periods of time, and the value of good architecture. I'm not sure, in the way that Inga Safran was looking at the situation, that much of what gets built today, especially in terms of housing, has much energy to it. Although there's definitely people out there who recognize that in Philadelphia, we're a row house city. In Philadelphia, we have, an exceptional group of existing buildings, and we ought to be doing something more with them, and that there are values that are inherently necessary in the future if we're going to survive on the planet, and make use of the resources that we have. That living more densely is significant, a significant value, but how we embrace the quality of architecture is important. So, one of the takeaways for me was examples like Cherokee, examples like Greenbelt Knoll up in the Northeast, which was integrated housing that Bob Bishop did with Morris Milgram, the housing that John Bauer and a bunch of other people, I.M. Pei did in Society Hill, the Friends Co-op that was mentioned earlier that Stoneroff was doing. There's being concerned for that heritage and making sure that it's around as a model in the future that we can turn to. That might be a good value, a good way to spend some time and energy. But a lot of what's built now, I'm not sure, you would see the same commitment to social concern, at the same level. But, I think Oscar was also experimenting a lot, and there was more room for that in his day. He died in 1970s. Well, there was still money to do that kind of stuff. And just a few years later, that dissipated or changed dramatically.
Well, Bill, I see a question from Dan Macy. Isn't it an odd fact that Kahn was involved with building a house for Ed Bacon, considering their notorious disagreements as far as city planning goes?
they weren't enemies their whole life. You know, I mean, I think Ed Bacon and Lou Kahn, they met in the 30s. And, you know, I think just based on, you know, if I can use for simplicity's sake, what Bacon was writing about Stoneroff, the idea that you have to think about the whole city, that's something that was very appealing to Kahn. I think they had a lot in common. And I think one of the reasons why, Stoneroff got, along with Bacon was the quickness with which you could shape an idea, you could be clear about it, and you could use a pragmatic series of steps to get something built in the world, and it didn't have to be perfect. I think maybe Kahn saw things a little bit differently and took longer and took a more circuitous pathway to develop his ideas. And I think from time to time that became a frustration for Bacon, because I think Bacon wanted to tie into the humanity and thoughtfulness that Kahn brought to his architectural thinking, but sometimes that his way of working might have been something of an impediment to Bacon. So there were tensions there. But I think there was also a fair amount of respect, at least for a good long while. And they worked on the Better Philadelphia exhibit together. I mean, Kahn was a part of that, although that was the kind of a breaking point between Kahn and Stoneroff, but I think, Kahn was very positive about Oscar's life, his contributions. And I think, in that way, Bacon did too. I think, that's telling me that Kahn and Bacon had a lot in common, although I think there was animosity for a reason. I'll tell you another time about sitting right in front of Ed Bacon when My Architect premiered in Philadelphia in 2003, and nobody kind of sat around him, and he got to be himself in the movie, and he loved it, and everyone thought that he was going to be angry, and he thought it was great. He got to tell Kahn, and what his attitude was about Kahn, or how he saw him in that moment, and what Nathaniel Kahn speaks about is when he first filmed Bacon, he was seated at his sofa in his living room on Locust Street, and he said, but he was seated, and then Nathaniel came back another time realizing he didn't have any energy, so he took him out on the sidewalk on the street, and Ed was filled with piss and vinegar. And so it animated because he was on a stage, right? So he was able to, the filmmaker, Nathaniel Kahn, was able to recognize that Bacon needed that. And that's what, it's his perspective, and he could be himself in that. So I think they saw how you would go about doing things in fundamentally different ways over time. And that became a frustration for Bacon, maybe because he thought that there was more potential for doing some of the things that Kahn maybe had in mind. Maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong.
Okay, there's one last thing. This is from Rob Fleming. It says Steve Gensler's work in South Philly. I don't know if that's supposed to be Steve Gendler or Steve Gensler. Are you here, Rob? Maybe Rob's not here.
I'm not sure what he's referring to.
I'm not either. Okay. Rob, if you're here, can you, I see you're still here. Can you just speak up and voice your question? Unmute yourself.
I'm thinking of something else. I was just Googling, trying to think of what I was thinking of, and I'm sorry.
Okay.
Well, Steve Gendler is
Okay.
here.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm thinking of. Misspelled it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think, Rob, you're probably thinking of Inga's characterization of Lincoln Square, which
that's right. I'm sorry. Misspelled your name.
Inga and I have known each other for many years, and she really did not want to learn about the artistic antecedents for that project. She's so focused on this metric thing. She really has an emotional problem with it. Developers can make wonderful buildings. I just came back from Copenhagen, and all Bjarke Engel's work is developer driven, and metrics are behind it. But you know, our price points in Philadelphia do limit the artistic expression. There's no doubt. But that's you remembered her take on Lincoln Square and others. She dumped on us a little bit badly. But that building has a Joseph Albers glass etching behind the pattern of the facade to get the tonality and the syncopation in the rhythms, and she just didn't want to hear about that, associating it with, you know, Avenue of the Arts. So it had an artistic intent, but she was focused on her metric problem.
Well, just to clear up my own confusion, there was a presentation you gave, I think, to one of the committees at the Chestnut Hill Conservancy a while back. It was a Zoom thing during the pandemic. And I was really struck by the development that you were doing around that old Baltimore and Philadelphia station. That's what I'm referring to. Am I correct in attributing that to you?
Yep, that's the same project.
Okay, that's what I'm referring to. That seemed to me to be visionary in the spirit that, that Johnny was searching.
I appreciate that. Yeah, we created a 1 acre large landscape on the roof deck. You know, unfortunately, it's for the residents, not the residents of the city, but we did create open area that is rare on the Avenue of the Arts. Matter of fact, we have the only open area. But you know, enough of all that. We tried to be inspired by the greats in Philadelphia. It's tricky. It's hard.
Thank you.
The area around Wayne Junction Station, and I'm blanking on the name of, I'm tip of my tongue. Susan and I are trying to remember the fellow that had the trolley car down there. And
Ken Weinstein.
yeah, he's doing that area around Wayne Junction, right? Quite lovely. Yeah, I mean, that would be an example, don't you think?
I don't know that design at all, actually. But I think some of the lessons here that Bill has outlined, I would love to think could influence the Blossom site, you know, down on East Mermaid Lane.
Yes.
Oh, right.
Amen.
That'd be great.
Well, it's been a really wonderful evening, Bill. You've really taught us all so much, and I'm really grateful for my newfound appreciation for Oscar Stonarov, and for Davidson Road and as well. It's a really special, little road. But of course, my greatest admiration is for you and your ability to do all of what you just did this evening without notes. Just storytelling in the most fascinating way with complete recall of everything. It's marvelous to witness, but it's also such a privilege to receive these stories from you. Thank you so much for spending all this time to pull this together for us. Really appreciate it.
No, and thank you for being concerned with this particular heritage. And, you know, when these sorts of things happen, it gives us a moment to pause and to just ask ourselves questions and to look at something closely. You know, part of what I get to enjoy doing is looking at the stuff that architects and landscape architects leave behind. And you got to look at things really closely. And I got to spend the day hanging out with Laurie Olin, looking through his archives, talking about Bryant Park and these other things, and just to get like some sense about how difficult this stuff is, how kind of the range of thinking that comes into it, and how it impacts our lives in daily ways. And sometimes we can lose sight of that. But hopefully events like this and the cause of trying to do something positive about the Bond House will you know, continue to keep us connected with this, you know, with good what makes good architecture. So, and good landscape. So thank you, Laurie, and thank you everyone for coming out and showing your concern and interest.
Well, I hope that that there will be more and more people investigating what how wonderful Davidson Road is. And if anyone is interested in learning more about the future of the Bond House at 721 Davidson, or perhaps being a part of the future of it, please stay in touch with us, with me, Lori at chconservancy.org. If you'd like to kind of be kept aware of what may be going on. I do ask, however, that nobody trespass onto that property. I know it's attractive, but let's not do that. Well, again, Bill, thank you so much. And thanks so much to everyone who came out this evening. It's been wonderful. And I think the beginning of something very exciting. So have a great evening, everyone. And I also want to just say thank you to Eileen Javers, who spoke earlier but didn't name herself, our board president. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks so much.
Oh, great job.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, from Eileen Javers, good night, everybody.
There you go.